He gave up his mansion, his money, and even his name, just to see who still loved the man beneath the millions. George Ellison had spent decades building an empire, surrounded by luxury, flattery, and polite lies. But in the quiet of his final years, he was haunted by a question no bank account could answer. Who truly cared about him? Not his wealth. So, one morning, he vanished. Left behind were trembling hands in a wheelchair and a soul desperate to be seen without the shine. He fled to a small distant village posing as a forgotten veteran, stripped of status but finally free to observe the truth. What he found there stunned him. But what his wife did next, that shattered everything he thought he knew about love. The wheelchair became his test of vulnerability. The water poured over him like a baptism into reality, washing away the lies. Tell us where you're watching from, because by the end of this, you may never see love the same way again. George Ellison had once been the man whose name moved markets, and whose signature could change the fate of entire industries. At 72, the tech mogul had retired with more money than he could ever spend, surrounded by everything money could buy, except certainty. In the quiet corners of his mansion, he wondered, were the people in his life drawn to his soul, or just orbiting his wealth? His elegant wife, Marilyn, once his source of grounding, had grown distant, still kind, still graceful, but somehow unreachable. Their children, sharp and media-polished, spent more time posting about family values than living them. George couldn't help but notice how often their conversations started with investment pitches and ended with estate planning. So, one evening without warning, he disappeared. Left a note with only 12 words. "I'm not dead. I just want to see who notices." Then he traded designer suits for faded linen, silence for the echoes of a place untouched by his reputation. He made his way to a remote rural village, where the internet was scarce and his name meant nothing. There he disguised himself as a forgotten war veteran, a man in a wheelchair who said little, smiled often, and waited. The change was jarring. The mansion's marble was replaced with mud walls, his Rolex with a donated watch. But in the quiet of this new world, George began to listen. To how strangers greeted each other without agenda. To how kindness came without calculation. He realized that silence, his own, became a mirror, revealing who truly saw him when the gold was stripped away. Back at home, no one filed a missing person report. His children called the family lawyer, not the police. His wife stayed silent, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses at every public appearance. George watched from afar, waiting, hoping, wondering if anyone would look beyond what he'd left behind and search for the man himself. The morning George vanished, he left nothing behind but a short letter typed in his usual serif font. "I'm not dead, but I want to see who mourns me." The words sent ripples through the Ellison household, but not in the way he had hoped. Marilyn sat at the edge of their grand piano bench for hours, the note in her trembling hand, eyes unfocused. She said nothing. Their children, on the other hand, sprang into action, not to search, but to strategize. Calls were made to family lawyers, not to the authorities. Estate plans were reviewed, his holdings assessed, and quiet conversations about succession began to unfold. No one asked where he might be, only when and how his assets could be secured. George watched all of it from afar, anonymously reading the headlines and social media buzz that followed his disappearance. Not one of his children stepped outside their city walls to search. Meanwhile, George had found peace in a small, dusty village, hours from any major town. He worked quietly at a local outreach center, helping rebuild huts, distributing supplies, and sitting in circles where stories were shared, not streamed. In this place, no one knew his name. He became Mr. George, the quiet elder in the wheelchair who always smiled but rarely spoke of himself. He slept under a thatched roof, wore second-hand clothes, and found a strange comfort in anonymity. Here, wealth was measured in trust, not possessions. And yet, some days, he ached for home, for one voice, one pair of eyes that might still see him behind the disguise. Weeks passed. Then, one humid afternoon, he heard a voice he'd memorized over decades. Marilyn. She was standing outside the outreach hut, speaking softly to a group of children. Dressed in plain linen, hair tied back, she asked if they'd seen an older man in a wheelchair, someone quiet with a silver beard and a limp. George froze in the shadows. His heart raced. She was here. Later, that evening, she found him. He was sitting under the old acacia tree, watching the sky shift colors. She approached slowly, barefoot in the dust. For a moment, they stared at each other, and George waited for the gasp, the tears, the confrontation. But none came. She knelt beside him, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and asked, "Would you like some water, sir?" Not a flicker of recognition in her voice. She knew. He saw it in the softness of her eyes. But she was choosing something else. She was playing along, and in that moment, everything shifted. Marilyn didn't return to the city after finding George. She stayed. Quietly, gracefully, as if the dusty roads and shared meals around fire pits were more familiar to her than cocktail galas and charity auctions. Each day she volunteered at the village's small shelter where George lived under the assumed name of Mr. Eli. She never called him by name. She never slipped, never hinted. Instead, she treated him like any other elder in need, helping him wash his hands before meals, spooning porridge into his bowl when his fingers trembled too much to grip the spoon, tucking the blanket around his legs when the nights turned cold. And George, stunned and silenced, watched her with the eyes of a man seeing love naked, for the very first time. Her touch was tender. Her words were soft. She would sing to the children at night and pray aloud before bed. And sometimes, just before her voice broke, she would say, "God, wherever my husband is, please let him feel loved." Every time she said those words, George had to fight back tears. She knew. There was no question now. Her presence was not born of confusion. It was a choice. A quiet, deliberate act of devotion that needed no explanation. The woman he had feared might be clinging to his fortune was, instead, loving a man without one. One evening, as the village stars blinked into the sky, George sat beside the old water well, his hands resting on his lap, his heart heavy with awe. Marilyn came to him, as she always did, with a folded blanket and a cup of tea. He couldn't take it any more. "Why do you help me?" he asked, his voice rough and tired. She sat beside him, not startled by the question, not rushing to answer, either. Her eyes met his, calm, knowing. "Because you remind me of the man I married," she whispered, before the world put diamonds in his ears and silence in his heart. George's chest cracked open, not from guilt, from something deeper, relief. She hadn't stopped loving him. She had just lost sight of him beneath the layers of wealth, ego, and guarded distance. But here, stripped of everything, she saw him again. The poetic twist cut sharper than any confession ever could. The woman he thought might love him for his empire loved him more without it. The next morning, George couldn't hold it in any longer. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of what he now knew to be true. He waited until the sun dipped low behind the hills and the village quieted down. Marilyn was by the fire, humming softly as she patched a child's torn blanket. Her hair, silver and loose, shimmered in the flames. George rolled closer, and with a voice cracked by emotion, he said, "Marilyn, it's me. It's really me." She didn't look surprised. Instead, she turned to him with a softness that melted through his guilt. Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile never wavered. "George," she whispered, "I knew the moment I saw you." He blinked, confused. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Marilyn reached for his hand and placed it gently on her heart. "Because I wanted you to feel what it's like to be cared for, not catered to. I wanted you to know that your worth was never measured by the size of our house or the cars in our garage. I didn't want to take your disguise from you. I wanted you to find the truth underneath it." Tears slipped down George's cheeks. All this time she had seen through the lie and chose to love the man behind it anyway. Her loyalty had not wavered. Her love had not dimmed. Meanwhile, back in the city, the legal team managing George's estate uncovered something else. His children, impatient, entitled, had been working with private advisors to forge legal amendments to access their inheritance early. The investigators found falsified signatures, backdated paperwork, and hidden conversations that confirmed the worst. Their grief had never been real, only their greed. The news was sent to George quietly, with photographs and documents enclosed. He didn't need to say anything. He simply looked at Marilyn and saw the contrast between vows spoken in youth and still worn like a second skin, and children who had sold their inheritance for pieces of a legacy they never earned. Marilyn still wore the watch he had given her 40 years ago. It no longer ticked, but she wore it every day anyway. "It doesn't tell time," she once told a young girl in the village, "but it reminds me that love has its own clock." Her vows were worn, weathered, but true. And now, as George sat beside the fire, broken and rebuilt, he realized he had tested the world, and only one person had passed. George returned to his estate not as the man who had once ruled empires, with boardroom strategy and digital power, but as someone quieter, wiser, and infinitely more human. By his side was Marilyn, not just as his wife, but as his anchor, his truth, and the proof that love, when real, asks for nothing in return. The staff lined up, stunned to see him alive. The media circled like bees, eager for a story. But George didn't offer a press conference. He offered a decision. Within days, his will was rewritten, not in secret, but boldly and with clarity. The billions he once reserved for corporate legacy were now dedicated to building shelters, schools, healthcare clinics, and outreach programs across rural and underserved communities. He created the Allison Foundation for Kindness and appointed Marilyn as its chair. "Because no one," he said, "knows the value of silent dignity like she does." The children were summoned to his office, expecting a reunion. What they got instead was a letter. It read, "You didn't lose my wealth. You lost my trust." The expressions on their faces were captured by estate cameras, but George never watched the footage. He didn't need to. His peace was no longer tied to how they reacted, but to how he had finally chosen to live. Marilyn never gloated. She worked quietly, visiting shelters, overseeing funding proposals, and answering handwritten letters from children in villages, like the one where she had found her husband. She led the foundation with the same calm grace she once poured into nursing George back to belief. In the final scene of his story, George sat once again in that village courtyard, but this time not in disguise. Children ran freely around him, splashing him with water as he laughed, head tilted back, arms open. The wheelchair was still there, but it was no longer a symbol of weakness. It was a throne of transformation. Every drop of water that hit his chest felt like a baptism into a life reborn. When asked in a rare interview what the entire journey had taught him, George answered simply, "I tested the world, and the only one who passed never even took the test." And that was how a billionaire, once lost in his riches, came home not with more, but with less, refined and returned. Not to power, but to purpose. He disappeared as a billionaire to test love, and returned a richer man than ever before. Not in dollars, but in something far more rare: clarity. George Ellison set out to strip away everything that could be bought, just to see what would remain. And in doing so, he found a love that needed no grand gestures, no wealth, no spotlight, just presence, just truth. Marilyn had seen through every mask and met the man beneath it, not to judge, not to lecture, but simply to love. Have you ever wondered who would still love you if you had nothing? Would your name still carry weight if your pockets were empty? If this story touched your heart, share it, because real love never asks for proof. It only gives, quietly, constantly. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story, where the smallest acts reveal the biggest truths.